Welcome back to the workshop. This episode is going to be a little more tame. We're going to go back to more of some of the tool stuff. I had a coworker ask me to restore his grandfather's cross peen. So, as you can see, the handle's a little bit short. Not sure why that is. I'm sure he had a good reason for it, for his use. But it's a bit poor put together. See, it used to come down about a quarter of an inch further than it did. Probably because he flared it with a nail. So, my method for restoring tools in general, especially old antique tools, first I like to clean up the steel. Something like this, not a whole lot of rust on it, so I would just take this to my wire wheel, clean up some of that paint that he had on there. Unlike something like this hammer here, I would take and soak that and let it soak for a day, probably. And then that makes the rust easier to take off. So first, I'm going to start by taking this little nubby handle off. We're going to scrap that one, and I'm going to make a new one out of this piece of hickory. I like to use hickory because it's got a nice straight grain, and for hammers it can take a lot of force. You don't want to do a super hard wood or anything with a wide grain because the grain tends to split more easily when force is applied to it. So I go for either a hickory or an ash. Sometimes you can get away with oak depending on what you're doing. I like to use oak for my chisels because they don't need to take a whole lot of force to them. It's a cutting edge, so if you've got a nice sharp chisel, you don't need to put a whole lot of force behind it. So I'm going to go ahead and pound this handle out. And then I'm going to go ahead and take this to the wire wheel and clean up the steel. He said he's not too worried about some of the marks on here. Just clean it up and put a new handle on it. Let's go ahead and do that. Now when I'm removing handles, I don't do anything fancy. I take my vise here and I leave it a little loose, just so it has some pressure on the hammer head. And then I use a railroad spike a lot of the time, depending if this opening is wide enough, and then I just pound that thing out. This one has a nail in it, so I'm curious to see how that goes. I may have to try and remove the nail first, but let's give it a crack. See, that railroad spike is starting to shred away on the inside there. It's not the best sign, but we have moved it a little. So I'm just going to keep hammering away until it pops out. And there we got a release from the handle. So I've gone ahead and cleaned it. See, all that paint is gone. That was the biggest issue really with this. Aside from some scratching you can see in here, which, like I said, he said he wasn't too concerned about. Me, I probably would have left it too if this were one of mine. But it's really easy to clean one of these. Just takes a little bit of effort and a little bit of sweat. And we got the handle off, this little nubby guy here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark out how I want to cut this. I'm going to cut it to the basic shape first. And then I'm going to go ahead and make the end that's going to go inside of the cross peen. I'm going to do that by copying a basic hammer shape. We're not going to do anything too fancy with this. We're not going to make it look, you know, medieval style or any fancy hammers like I've done in the past with some of my ball peens. I like this look. It's not completely necessary, but you know, it gives it more of like a war hammer look, or so to speak. Both of my ball peens that I have both have this handle, and I also have a claw hammer that has a similar style handle. I like the design. It's not for everybody, but we're going to do just a standard handle. Now that I got my basic design drawn on here. I'm going to go ahead and basically roughly shape this out. And before I do any final shaping, I'm going to fit the top part to the hole in the hammer. So I'm going to go zip this on my bandsaw, and we'll be right back. Now when I shape my hammer handles, I get it down to the basic rough shape, and then I like to carve out where it's going into the hammer first before actually shaping it. That way I can get it nice and squared out, and then I can use that as my point to make sure that it's rounded on all edges. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just do the very top part. That way I can get the basic shape, and then from there I'll bring it down to where the hammer is going to end on this handle. Now when I do any kind of shaping like this, I go to my trusty Shinto rasp. I go on the heavy side of it first to get it basically down to where it needs to be, and then I'll move to the finer one to clean it up. So like I said, I'm just doing the very top of this, going maybe a quarter, about quarter, 3/8 down. So I'm just going to do that very top part just to get it started, and then from there I'm going to square it off down to the rest of the depth. Alright, I like that fit. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the depth. So you can see it's still snug. So I'm going to continue shaving a little bit at a time just to make sure I don't take too much off, because I still want it to be snug toward the bottom. Now that I'm happy with the fit of this, we're going to move on to shaping the handle. I don't want to drive this too far down the shaft because I don't want to get it stuck before I cut the wedge and put the wedge in there. So we're going to go ahead and start shaping this handle to more of an ergonomic design. Alright, now that I got it this far, I'm going to fix the handle to it. See, I put a split down here. When I do hammer handles, now I'm not saying I'm any expert, but I take a hardwood wedge and I put it down the center of it, and then once that is all dry, I will take and I will drive a metal pin the opposite direction just to add some stability to it. So I'm going to affix this to it so that if there's anything that I need to clean up afterwards, that I can sand it all off, and then we're going to apply a coat of finish to it. Now, I always like to start off the handle just like this, and then you hold it firmly in your hand and you let the momentum drive it in. You can see it slowly climbing up there. And then you can see we've got it fixed all the way up. Now it's going to take and tighten up the slit we just made. So I'm going to go ahead and widen that a little bit, chamfer it on the top with a chisel so that then I can drive this piece in. I'm going to use some glue just so it stays in place. I'm going to then use some glue so that it stays in place. Once the glue is dried, then we'll run our metal stake in. And now that we got that wedge in there, I'm going to go ahead and drive the stake the opposite direction. Now that that's in there, you should have a nice stable handle. I'm going to go ahead and let those dry. And then once that's all dried, I'm going to give this one more final sanding, and then I'm going to start applying the finish to it. Alright, now that the glue is dried, off camera I went ahead and put some stain on here. My camera ran out of space, so I wasn't able to get a video of that. I'm going to go ahead and put some shellac on here. I went with this color because I didn't like how blonde it turned out when I was done carving. Alright. Now, just like with anything, I go heavy on the first coat, and then I will lighten up on my coats preceding that. My basic premise was to show you that it's not hard to obtain hand tools. Most of the hammers that I have gotten have been primarily given to me and procured for very little money otherwise. And this, over the span of 4 to 6 hours, I completed the entire hammer. It's not hard to do. With a little effort, you can have yourself a nice tool with just a little bit of work and not a lot of money. As always, if you like what you see, hit that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you'd like to see. And we'll see you next week. Bye.